You are welcome. This is the Messiah channel. Today we are looking at a prophecy in the book of Genesis. When is that prophecy going to be fulfilled? Which nation is referred to in the prophecy in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 14? So we read it for the record. Genesis 15, verse 13. And he said unto Abram, Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And this is the occasion where the Lord was speaking to Abraham, warning him, informing him that his descendants will be afflicted for 400 years in a land that is not theirs. And the Lord also added a future prophecy in Genesis 15, verse 14. And also that nation whom they shall serve, I will judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And which nation is the prophecy talking about? We look at the prophecy and we see the words afflicted for 400 years. Which people were afflicted for 400 years? Definitely these are the children of Jacob, afflicted for 400 years in Egypt. Is the prophecy in Genesis 15 talking about the Egypt that is in Africa, or is it pointing to another Egypt? Exodus 20 verse 2 talks about a land of bondage, that is Egypt. So Egypt in prophecy refers to a land of bondage. But as we see Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 14, the Lord doesn't identify Egypt. And the Lord talks about a nation that will afflict his people for 400 years. Are we talking about the affliction of Hebrews in Egypt in the Old Testament, or are we talking about the affliction of Hebrews in a new Egypt that is not specified in the Bible? The records are pointing to an Egypt, a land of bondage, and that is definitely United States of America. As we talk about the United States of America as the nation identified in Genesis chapter 13 and 14, we look at the affliction of the children of Jacob, the Hebrew Israelites. They went through three phases of affliction: the D, the S, and the P. The D standing for affliction in the dungeons, the slave dungeons in Africa. The S standing for affliction in the slave ships along and over the Atlantic Ocean. And the P stands for affliction on the plantations in the land of bondage. And the US is very unique because unlike Denmark, unlike Great Britain, France, unlike Netherlands, Portugal, that afflicted the children of God along the dungeons in Africa, on the slave ships, and also on plantations in the Caribbean and in North America. United States went further in the affliction of the Hebrew Israelites. And the calamity that was inflicted on the Hebrew Israelites in the United States is unprecedented. And when other nations has abolished slavery, United States continue with slavery, and it was United States that had to go through a civil war on the issue of ending the affliction of the Hebrew Israelites. And even when the Hebrew Israelites went out of plantation, and they quickly were subjugated and afflicted in prisons. And even when they went out of the prisons, the Hebrew Israelites were afflicted through structural violence. And structural violence is a theory by Johann Gatun, a researcher who talks about how a system inflicts punishment, inflicts violence on people. They wouldn't kill you directly, but they will put in structures and they will put in a system where you self-kill. You are suffocated by a system that causes structural violence. And so in the affliction that we are talking about in the New Egypt, which is the United States, we saw affliction in the slave dungeons in Africa, where they were raped and they were sodomized, denied of food. They were put in condemned cells where they died out of starvation, out of thirst. And they also suffered affliction on the slave ships, and they could not lift up their heads. And they were subjugated, they were humiliated, and some of them could not make the voyage, the horrendous voyage along the Middle Passage to the land of bondage, United States. And after they arrived, of course, you know what happened on the slave plantations in the United States. And after going through civil war, and the children of Abraham could not even get the privilege and immunities of a citizen of the United States. And he took amendments, the 13th and the 14th Amendment, to confer citizenships on the children of Jacob in the land of bondage in the United States. And in 1884, 1885, the allies of the United States, they engaged in a conspiracy against the children of Jacob. And they met in an Euro-Gentile nation, Germany, Berlin, 1884, 1885, dividing Africa among themselves. You can say that United States was not part of the Berlin Conference. After all, Berlin Conference took place in 1884, not long after America had been formed in 1776. But you know that the colonialism and exploitation of African resources benefited the United States, because the United States colluded with the Berlin powers to deny independence to the African nations, the black African nations. And the United States fought on the side of the Berlin powers in subjugating the African continent. And the records of colonialism and the wars of colonialism are clear, and the United States was on the side of colonialism and new colonialism, being a major participant in new colonialism that occurred in Africa years after the so-called slave trade and slavery had been abolished, quote unquote. And so definitely the US stands out as a nation that is referenced in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 14. And what is the fate of the United States, the land of bondage, as identified in Genesis, Genesis chapter 15, verse 14? The Lord told Abraham, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. The nation whom they shall serve. It's important to know that the Lord was talking about a nation, not nations. The Lord was talking about a nation, a specific nation, and that will afflict his people for 400 years. And it's not talking about the 14 Gentile nations that met in Berlin, because they were 14. There were many nations. The Lord did not say nations. The Lord said, and also that nation which they shall serve will I judge. And so the Lord is very specific about a nation, and the United States is notorious in the affliction and subjugation of the children of Jacob, the affliction in the dungeons, the affliction aboard the slave ships, the affliction on the plantations in Mississippi and North Carolina, Maryland, and other places, affliction in the prisons where the Hebrews, when they went out of plantations, were taken into the prisons that profiteth the slave owners. And even when they got out of plantation, there were other forms of affliction through structural violence. Affliction institutionalized in the criminal justice system. And so, for example, 1996, in the case of United States versus Armstrong, there was an issue whether a black man and a white man will receive the same sentence, whether a white man who uses a white powder will get a lower sentence than a black man who uses what they call crack cocaine. And so you saw disparities in sentences between a black man and a white person, even for the same offense of engaging in illegal substance. And not only that, in the case of McCleskey versus Kemp, a case in Georgia, you saw a black man challenging his death sentence, arguing that there are disparities in how the United States imposes death sentence on people depending upon whether the defendant is a white man or a black man. The case is McCleskey versus Kemp, Kemp. You can Google and you can look at how the Hebrew Israelites were afflicted in a land of bondage, referred to, reference in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 14. The Lord has said, has decreed that that nation will I judge. So judgment is coming. And what would be the kind of judgment? And looking at the judgment in Egypt, the judgment against the pharaohs of Egypt, you can see that the Lord used plagues. And somebody will be tempted to conclude that the Genesis 15 judgment has already occurred, and it occurred in Egypt. But they are wrong, because you have to remember that even after Egypt, the Lord told Moses that his brothers and sisters, they will go to Egypt again, and this time in slave ships, and they will be sold as slaves. And the Lord was referencing the transatlantic slave trade in Genesis, in Deuteronomy 28, verse 68. And so the punishment, the judgment that the Lord is talking about in Genesis 15, verse 14, is not the plagues that were inflicted on Egypt, the first Egypt. The judgment is talking about the judgment that will come onto a nation that will afflict the children of Jacob, and those who will be sent into Egypt again, this time in slave ships. They will not go into Egypt on camels, as Jacob and his children did in the old Egypt. They will go into the new Egypt in slave ships, and they will be sold as slaves. And that actually occurred in the land of bondage, United States, where Hebrew Israelites were auctioned, and they went into afflictions for the prophetic 400 years period, and the affliction is still continuing. And as we look into Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 14, we are asking a question: when will the judgment begin, or has the judgment begun? And as we are talking about the judgment, we can talk about three types of judgment. And the judgment of plagues, as happened in Egypt, and a similar plagues will happen in the Egypt that is coming. Another form of judgment that the Lord has used and will use against the nations that afflicted his people. I'll call that judgment the Zechariah judgment, the carpenter judgment. Here we're talking about the judgment that the Lord will inflict on the Gentile powers, the Euro-Gentile powers that scattered Judah and Jerusalem, as recorded by the prophet Zechariah in Zechariah chapter 1, verses 18 to 20. So we see the plagues as happened in Egypt, when the Lord himself inflicted judgment on the pharaohs and his people. And here we are also expecting the Lord anointing the craftsmen, the carpenters, the Zechariah carpenters, that will cut the horns of the Gentile powers that afflicted the Hebrew Israelites. So we are talking about plagues, we are talking about Zechariah carpenters, who will be nations that will cut the horns on the Gentile powers. But in addition, we can also foresee that the nation that the Lord is talking about is a nation that can also self-destruct herself. So we're talking about judgment by self-destruction. And that has been the case of imperial powers that have self-destructed themselves after exploiting other nations. They end up destroying themselves. They destroy themselves by moral decay. They stress themselves, they stretch themselves, they engage in imperial overstretching, and very soon their empires fall. Britain went through the same experience, and Rome went through the same experience. As imperial powers, they stretched themselves, they overstretched themselves, and they self-destructed the empires. And you can see America will do the same: self-destruction, moral decay, and imperial overstretching. And it will come to a point where America will decline, consistent with history, that all imperial powers, they rise. They rise, but do not rise, and rise. They rise, they fall, and they fall, as Rome fell, as Great Britain, Great Britain fell. It fell, and it was humiliated in the Suez Canal crisis, even humiliated when a small nation, Argentina, was able to sink a British ship, a nation that boasted herself, boasted to be the naval power, and in history, her ship was sunk by Argentina in the Falkland Island crisis. So we are talking about a nation in Genesis chapter 15, a nation that will be judged by God himself. and the panoply of judgment are a lot. The Lord is capable of inflicting plagues on Egypt, America, as he did in the first Egypt. And the Lord who is also capable of raising Zechariah carpenter nations, as he has promised, as he showed Zechariah in a vision, the carpenter nations that will come to, to fray, to intimidate, to distort, and to destroy the Gentile powers that scattered Judah and Jerusalem. They scattered them in such a way that Judah was not able to lift up his head in the slave dungeons, in the slave ships, and in the slave plantation. And Judah was humiliated, subjugated, and became a proverb and a byword. But the judgment is coming. Genesis 15, judgment is coming. It's a judgment decreed from the corridors of Elohim, corridors of the courts of the one who is the king of the earth, and he is the Lord of the Hebrews. And he has decreed that he will visit that nation, but we should not talk about the time that we will visit that nation, and the time will come, because the Lord, he takes his stone, but he doesn't throw it immediately. It's an African proverb. The Lord takes a stone, but he doesn't throw the stone immediately. He's going to judge Babylon. I'm talking about Babylon, America, that scattered the children of Judah in dungeons and on slave ships and also on slave plantations, scattered them into prisons, and is using all forms of institutional racism to subjugate the children of Judah who are in Babylon, or even Babylon, United States. Genesis 15, judgment is coming, and there's also going to be a James judgment. James judgment per the writings of the book of James, that those who exploit the labor of people without payment is an abomination unto the Lord, and the Lord will judge them. And so the Lord will judge America for exploiting and coveting the labor of Hebrew Israelites without payment. And as people are talking about reparation that was given to the Jews, reparation given to other people, and people demanding reparation to be given to the Hebrew Israelites, we are not talking about the reparations. We are talking about judgment that is coming, and Elohim has decreed that he will judge the nation that afflicted the Hebrew Israelites for the prophetic 400 years. What type of judgment is coming, and when will the judgment come? Will plagues come to United States, the nation that afflicted the Hebrew Israelites? Of course, we hear of plagues. The book of Revelation, chapter 18, verse 4, uh, reminds us of plagues that are coming. An angel even told those who are living in Babylon, come out of her so that you do not receive her plagues. So plagues are coming. But in addition to plagues, are there going to be Zechariah carpenters that will cut the horns of the Gentile power that afflicted the children of Jacob? And as we are talking about Zechariah powers, so many visions have been recorded. And you know the vision of Dimitri Duduman, a Romanian pastor, an Eastern European pastor who saw the destruction of the United States by Russia in a vision that is recorded. And I'm also reminding you of a vision that I saw in August 2018, where in that vision I saw a radio announcement, and I saw an announcement that Russia was going to strike the United States in 30 minutes time. And so the Lord has a combination of judgments by plagues, as he did in the old Egypt, and as he will do in the new Egypt, as recorded in Revelation chapter 18, verse 4. And of course, there's another form of judgment, the judgment of self-destruction, where the land of bondage that took people into bondage will self-destroy itself economically, materially, and also morally. And you will see moral decay coming into the land of bondage. That is self-destruction. The nation will self-destroy itself. But I believe that there will be a combination of judgment by plagues at the time chosen by Elohim himself, judgment by carpenter powers, craftsmen, Zechariah carpenter and nations that will be anointed to desolate and destroy the land of bondage that took Hebrew Israelites into bondage, into captivity. And the time is coming. The final trumpet of heaven has sounded based upon revelation that was given to me on August 27 and 2013. And judgment will come. Judgment will come. Even if it tallies, it will come based upon the prophecy in Habakkuk. Even when the vision tallies, it will come. Even when the prophecy tallies, it will come. And here we are talking about Genesis 15, prophecy of judgment on a nation that afflicted the seed of Abraham for a prophetic 400 years. And after that, the Lord said he would judge that nation, the nation that took Hebrew Israelites into captivity through slave ships and through exploitation on plantation, so that the Hebrew Israelites could not lift up their heads. The prophet Zechariah saw that the children of Abraham, the children of Jacob, Judah, they were scattered and they were treated so bad that they could not lift up their heads. How can you lift up your head when somebody's nail is on your neck? George Floyd. How can you lift up your head when somebody's nail is on your neck? And so Zechariah was right. He saw Gentile nations that scattered Judah and Jerusalem in such a way that Judah, the Hebrew Israelites, could not lift up their head because somebody's neck was on their head. And judgment is coming, and it's a warning. It's a warning to that nation, the nation referenced in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13 and 14. That nation that is going to be judged by the Lord himself. The Lord said, I will judge. The judge is the Lord himself. And I don't know whether the judgment will be cruel or unusual, because the United States talks about cruel and unusual punishment. In the lexicon of Elohim, who lives out in heaven, there's nothing like cruel and unusual. Those who took people into captivity will themselves go into captivity, and they will be judged. And that is the decree from the corridors of Elohim as recorded in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 to 14. And that is the record of heaven, The records are closed and it is not appealable. Nobody can appeal the judgment of Elohim recorded against the nation, the scattering nation that afflicted the Hebrew Israelites for 400 years. We are talking about the judgment of God, Genesis 15 judgment that is coming so quickly onto Babylon, land of bondage, Egypt of our time. My email is raptureafrica@yahoo.com. I'm leaving it in the description box. Thank you very much.